He lived in the middle of town, but he was never truly part of it. His home might sit on the edge of the square, close enough to the market for people to see his window, but far enough that no one came to call. Brought justice swift and visible, but also reminded everyone of the frailty of their own lives. From the day he accepted the role, perhaps inherited it from his father, perhaps pressed into it by circumstance, he had known what would be lost. Respect, trust, communion. His neighbors would never see him the same way again. He might buy his bread in the same bakery, but he would eat it alone. A poorly timed drop meant minutes of strangulation, not seconds of silence. Learned how to swing through muscle, not bounce off bone. He practiced alone, sometimes on pigs, sometimes on straw men, because practice meant fewer mistakes. When even the dogs had gone to sleep, he would lie in bed and hear the names of those he had executed. Some had pleaded. Some had laughed. Some had locked eyes with him in those final moments, as if trying to see his soul. He remembered their faces. Not out of guilt, but out of duty. He had taken something no one else could give back, and so he carried it. Every name, every scream, every final breath. Walked the edges of the woods. Listened to birds no one else bothered to name. He liked silence. It was the only time he didn't feel the weight of eyes, of judgment, of old blood dried beneath his fingernails. Fewer cries. A mug of ale after the work was done. Second if the crowd had jeered too loudly. A third if the prisoner had been too young. The town allowed it. They didn't invite him to feast days, but they left him his corner in the tavern. The barkeep never looked him in the eye, but always filled his cup. Fewer ghosts, or those who did boys too poor or desperate to do anything else rarely lasted long. A smith, a soldier, a farmer, but he had hands shaped by the axe, not the plow. Eyes trained to measure fear, shoulders that had learned to carry the weight of the condemned. He didn't pity himself. He didn't expect pity. He simply was what the town required and what it refused to acknowledge. They fainted at the first hanging, trembled when asked to clean the blade. He didn't blame them. This was a life you didn't choose for glory. You accepted it because someone had to, because the law demanded a hand and the town looked away when it swung, and though the crowd might cheer for justice, they would curse him for incompetence. He had seen it happen to others in his line. Executioners who missed their mark, who swung 3, 4, 5 times to sever a neck, who were stoned by angry mobs not for killing but for not killing well. He might pray in the same chapel, but from the very back pew. Every whisper behind his back would carry the weight of old executions. Every child's scream at the sight of him would echo long after the square was empty. One misstep, one accusation, and it might be his blade you faced. So, even as they hired him, watched him, paid him, they treated him as a man apart, a shadow that walked in daylight. Children were warned not to go near. Mothers crossed the street when he approached. And though he paid his taxes like anyone else, many officials refused to shake his hand. For every noble execution on a scaffold, witnessed by crowds in the city square, there were far more ignoble tasks, cleaning the body after, in a chest beneath the floor, wrapped in cloth, cleaned with vinegar. The axe, heavy in iron. The sword, long and balanced. The rope woven tightly and measured carefully, not too short or the neck wouldn't snap, not too long or the head might tear off. He measured it every time. He counted the knots. He checked the trapdoor twice, carrying the head to the gate, burning the bloodied rope, burying the corpse of a man everyone wanted gone, but no one wanted to touch. And he did it all, not with joy, but with precision, with ritual, with a kind of tired honor. They knew him by name, by trade, by reputation, but rarely by friendship, because he was the executioner. To the townspeople, he was a figure both feared and needed. And he understood this. He was paid well, but not richly. His job was dangerous, but not glamorous. His tools were kept sharp, but hidden, because failure wasn't just embarrassing, it was cruelty. A botched execution meant suffering. A dull blade meant screams. He studied anatomy, knew where the spine met the skull. Still, the ghosts came at night when the town was quiet. He drank sometimes. Not to forget, but to dull the edge of memory. He had no apprentices, at least not often. No one wanted the trade. Some days he wondered what else he could have been. There were days without executions, long stretches of quiet. On those days, he read, studied, and then the bell would toll, and the next name would be called, and he would rise, as he always did, wrap the blade, check the rope, and step back into the shadow the town had built for him. Not because he wanted to, but because someone had to. The axe did not begin with him. It came from his father before that, passed down like a trade, like a secret, like a curse too heavy for ordinary hands. In many parts of medieval Europe, execution was not just a job, it was a bloodline, family business. But he had heard them. From the back of the crowd, from their home near the edge of the square. The way the sound shifted, boisterous at first, almost festive, until the moment grew near, the hush, the priest's whisper, the murmuring of a name. No formal handing over of the blade, just a day when his father's hand shook a little more than usual. When the man's breath was too thin. You marry within your caste or don't marry at all. You keep your head down. You accept the coin, but not the praise. Your children will be feared, your grandchildren too. You may live in the same town for 50 years and die without ever being invited to a wedding. How to avoid personal attachment. Some said it was better to wear the hood so you wouldn't be recognized. Others said the hood was cowardice. Others stayed in the family home, cleaning tools, preparing herbs, whispering prayers that no one would hear. In a few rare families, daughters took up the axe themselves, quietly, without ceremony, without history remembering their names. That if you take a life, you take it with your face uncovered. Every scar on the handle, a mark of survival. Opinions varied. But in every lineage, the message was the same. Don't flinch. Because towns never forget. They remember what you did, who you were, what your name once meant. Even if it's your grandson running the bakery, there will always be someone to whisper. That's the executioner's bloodline, when he nodded at his son and said, "You do it." And so he did. He stepped onto the scaffold, guided by years of watching, and ended a life. The name, he forgot it. The contradiction was never discussed. That the same hands that pulled teeth, or lanced boils, or set broken bones, were also those that swung the sword. The role was a paradox giver and taker, protector and destroyer. And so, within executioner families, a strange kind of knowledge bloomed. Anatomy, pressure points, how skin tore, how long a body convulsed after hanging, the things most people were lucky never to know. They knew by heart. The crowd, a blur, but the feeling of the axe in that moment, its pull, its thud, the jolt through his arms never left him.
Owie.
And then the silence just before the drop, the slice, the sudden eruption of noise that followed. Sometimes cheers, sometimes gasps, sometimes dry, stunned quiet, as if the soul had been torn not just from the body on the block, but from every onlooker as well. Because while the town might hate the man with the axe, they needed him more than they admitted. He was the sword arm of the law. Without him, justice was incomplete. One that couldn't be escaped, no matter how far a child might run, or how loudly a mother might pray for her son to take a gentler path. The first time he held the axe, he was 11. It was heavier than he expected. The iron head cold, even in summer. The shaft slick from years of oiling. His father showed him how to balance it not just with arms, but with the entire body. "You don't swing," the man said quietly. "You drop. Let the weight do the work. You guide it. You don't force it. Digging the grave when needed, carrying the hood." He learned how to read the faces of prisoners not for guilt or innocence, but for fear, for anger, for the moment when a man might try to run. He learned to spot trembling knees, shallow breathing, the ones who talked too much, and the ones who said nothing at all. He spoke as if he were teaching the boy to fish. But this wasn't about catching dinner. This was about ending lives. He hadn't yet seen an execution at that age. His father didn't talk about the people he executed. Not in stories, not at dinner. The work stayed in the yard. The tools stayed locked away. But once when the boy asked how many, the man's face darkened. "Enough," he said. "Enough to know it's never the same." That was the end of it. By the time the boy was 15, he was assisting. Not with the blade, but with the preparation. Setting up the platform. coiling the rope. There were no ceremonies when he performed his first execution. Some families passed down land, others passed down a craft blacksmithing, tanning, weaving. His family passed down death, and with it came the rules. Still, there were advantages. Some executioner families were granted privileges lands outside town, tax exemptions, even special protections. In some regions, the executioner also served as torturer, or healer, or gravedigger. Fathers taught sons how to cut quickly, how to hold the eyes of the condemned. Daughters of executioners carried a different burden. Few would marry them. Many assumed they were cursed. Some became midwives, another profession filled with blood and risk. The axe was never just iron, it was inheritance, symbol of generational burden. Every nick in the blade, a story. And even if the son someday laid the tool down, hoping his child might have a cleaner life, the shadow never left. It wasn't just a role, it was a legacy. Before a man ever stood upon the scaffold with a crowd gathered at his feet, before a sentence had been read aloud or a prayer whispered by the condemned, the executioner had already spent years preparing for that single moment, that single swing, that single breathless second when the blade met flesh. There were no public signs, no apprentices clamoring to learn, no laughter or songs as the day's labor passed. Instead, it was often a quiet, shadowed place-part study, part sanctum, part prison of tools. Not on humans, but on substitutes. Large animals. He learned where tendons connected, where the spine curved, how many vertebrae from the skull to the back. Longer, more elegant, but far less forgiving. The block carved from solid wood, stained from years of use. It had to be level, steady, never cracked. He was not a torturer by trade, though sometimes he wore that mantle. But when it came to ending a life, his duty was not to make it last, it was to make it end swiftly. There were hooks and gurneys for drawing and quartering, because someone had to. Because the executioner, for all his shadows, was the final hand of the law. The last chapter in a person's life. The silence after the judgment. Red-hot pincers, though rarely used, were kept polished. Branding irons, chains, all were part of his hidden arsenal. All maintained with reverence, not pleasure. He did not speak of this knowledge, but he carried it quietly, completely. Because when he failed, the whole town would remember, pigs especially. Their necks, similar in density to a human's, offered a close approximation. A quiet liturgy. The block inspected for splinters. A priest might arrive early to sanctify the space. The executioner would arrive earlier, pacing the area, placing each tool, walking each step, as if mapping out the choreography of death. He did not perform for the crowd. He performed for the condemned, for the law, for the silence that followed. Sharpening the blade before dawn, cleaning the rope with vinegar or boiling water, setting aside clean cloths not for mercy, but for decency, for binding hands, for covering the head, for wiping blood when the sentence was carried out. He did not speak to others about this routine. It was sacred. It was necessary. The executioner would raise the blade and let it fall again, and again until he knew without looking where it would land, until his arms ached, until his breathing matched the rhythm of each drop. Once sentenced, their suffering became his responsibility. To drag out their death through negligence was to commit an error of justice, and those errors lived on, in whispers, in legend, in nightmares. There were stories of executioners who trembled before the swing, who missed once, twice, who had to stop to catch their breath. Men who never recovered from the shame, who drank themselves into oblivion, who took their own lives when the crowd turned on them, till the tool became not an extension of his hand but of his will. There, behind heavy doors and thick curtains, the executioner practiced with the tools of his trade, not just for mastery, but to protect the condemned from agony. Because execution, for all its brutality, was a skill, a grim craft. A discipline that demanded more than strength, demanded study, control, restraint, and above all, precision. The executioner's workshop did not look like that of a blacksmith or tanner. The axe was not swung like a weapon in battle. It was not wild or theatrical. It had to be guided. For hangings, precision mattered just as much. A rope too short could cause slow strangulation, minutes of gasping, twitching, eyes bulging as the lungs collapsed inward. A rope too long might tear the head from the neck entirely, a horror that sickened even the crowd, that stained the executioner's name with incompetence. So he learned to measure the prisoner's height, their weight, their age, their health. All were factors in the calculation. He would tie the noose carefully, use knots that held but did not crush. He'd test the mechanism twice, 3 times. Always in secret, always alone. Directed, its weight had to be understood in the wrist, the shoulder, the spine. A single mistake, a hesitation, a misaligned blow, a dull edge could turn a clean death into a public horror. The goal was always speed, not cruelty. Precision, not spectacle. The best executioners were those who left no mark beyond what was necessary. 1 strike, 1 silence. 1 moment of mercy in a world that had already judged. To achieve that, they practiced. Then came the rope. He studied anatomy not as a physician, but as someone who needed to know where to strike, or not to, what angle would be cleanest. Beyond the axe and the rope, there were other tools. The sword used for beheadings of nobles. There was a ritual to his preparation. Some towns required a dry run or rehearsal. It's the platform built the night before, trapdoor tested with weighted sacks. Failure was the worst sin. Did not matter if the condemned was a thief, a murderer, a traitor. That fear kept the executioner sharp, disciplined, focused, not cruel but exact. And even when the crowd jeered, when children threw stones, when priests looked away, he held to that code. And he would not let that silence be broken by incompetence. He trained not for himself, but for the one whose head would rest on the block. In the medieval world, death was not always private, was not hidden away in sterile white rooms or whispered about behind closed doors. It was public, loud, deliberate, and filled with meaning. Sometimes it was shouted, sometimes nailed to the church door, a name, a crime, a punishment. Merchants set up carts early, selling boiled wine, baked goods, honey-roasted nuts. Parents brought children, either to scare them into obedience or because there was nowhere else to leave them. A chant from the priest walking with the condemned. Their crimes varied: murder, theft, heresy, treason. Some wept, some prayed, some screamed their innocence to the crowd, even as they mounted the steps. Some walked with dignity, heads high. Some sang hymns through cracked lips. And then came the silence. A deep, eerie stillness, like the world itself had paused to watch. The executioner would raise his blade or gesture for the trap door, and just like that, in a heartbeat, life was gone. A few collapsed and had to be dragged. The executioner waited at the top, silent, impassive, his face often hidden beneath a hood, not always for anonymity, but to create distance, to become something less than human in the eyes of the crowd. A figure, a shadow, symbol. In certain places, the executioner wore red, in others, black, using sticks, ropes, toy swords. It became a part of the culture, woven into songs, into jokes, into daily life. Even when the crowd had gone, when the blood had dried, when the name of the condemned had been forgotten, the act remained with him. The silence before the drop, the weight of the swing, the way a crowd can cheer at death and go home whistling, a warning told by candlelight, mind your manners, or the man with the axe will come. And that sometimes the loudest applause came not for mercy, but for the spectacle of a man being broken in front of them. People feared him, but they also relied on him to make justice visible, to turn law into flesh. In rare ceremonies, he removed his hood just before the blow so the condemned could see the face of death. The crowd hushed, almost reverent, though not for the prisoner. For the moment, for the spectacle about to unfold. Couples came arm in arm. Pickpockets blended into the crowd. Even clergy arrived, standing solemnly near the scaffold to represent mercy or to remind everyone that divine judgment was never far behind. The people would murmur, nod, scoff, or gasp. And beneath it all, the executioner standing still, waiting for it to end. Children would ask questions their parents tried not to answer, hung from gallows as warnings. A gruesome reminder that law had teeth, that justice had hands. He would wash the blood away. unbind the limbs, carry the corpse to a cart. The crowd would disperse, some sobered, some entertained, some indifferent. But all of them would remember. But everyone would remember the date. Everyone would mark the time, because few would willingly miss it. An execution, after all, broke the monotony of medieval life. It was event and warning, spectacle and sermon, all in one. They were tools, used by kings, lords, and city councils to maintain control, to instill fear, to channel public anger away from themselves. The more public the crime, the more public the death. It was a strategy, a message. And the executioner, though hated, was the one who made that message real. And few spectacles drew the attention of a city or village like an execution. These were not quiet affairs. They were performances. Dramas played out on scaffolded stages, with real blood, real screams, and real consequences, constructed with care, not for beauty, but for stability. No one wanted it to collapse. The stairs creaked as the executioner tested them one final time. The trapdoor mechanism checked. The noose knotted, the block polished, positioned, aligned to catch the light. Everything was ready. The executioner, he was not just a blade wielder. He was the final actor in a long, brutal story the public had come to watch again and again. The announcement would come days in advance. A town crier standing in the square reading the sentence from a parchment. On the morning of the act, the streets began to stir before sunrise. The platform was already waiting, built the night before, or stored permanently in some cities. And then the music might start, not joyful, but ceremonial. A single drum, a slow tolling bell. The condemned walked slowly, flanked by guards. And when the moment came, it was never quite the same. A speech might be read by a town official or the priest. The condemned might be offered a final word. Some begged for forgiveness, some cursed the law. The reaction from the crowd was unpredictable. Gasps, applause, screams. A nervous laugh from someone too young to understand the weight of what they'd seen. His work wasn't finished yet. He had to display the body, or the head, not just the death, but the show. Because in medieval society, executions were more than punishments. Some towns even choreographed the event. Where the priest should stand, how many guards should surround the scaffold, what colors should be worn. Children would reenact executions in play. And yet, for the executioner, the performance never truly ended. It taught him something, that justice wasn't always clean. That punishment wasn't always about guilt. He never forgot that, because he had to live among those people. He knew one day they might cheer just as loudly, if it were ever him on the block. He could walk through the market, purchase bread with clean coin, offer a nod to the town guards, but he would never be truly seen, not as a neighbor, not as a man. He was the executioner, and that meant something more than a job. No law that barred him from touching fruit at the stalls or entering the chapel on feast days. But the judgment came anyway, in glances, in silence, in the slow way a butcher wiped his hands before accepting his money, in the way children were pulled away when he passed, as if his shadow might burn them. He knew what they called him: butcher, curse-bearer, devil's hand. Not loudly, never to his face. But he heard. Helped a fallen cart back onto its wheels, covered the condemned with cloth when the body was left too long in the sun. But none of that mattered. The townsfolk only saw the blade, not the hand that held it. It meant he carried a mark, one that stained deeper than blood. In some regions, executioners were required to live in special houses, walled off, marked with symbols. In others, they could not touch water from the town well, had to wear a bell when walking, could not be buried in the same graveyard as the townspeople. The fear of contamination, of moral rot, was too strong. One that could not be washed away even by time, but after they turned their backs, pretended not to know the man who had delivered their justice, pretended he was not flesh and bone, that he was only the axe, only the rope. There was no formal decree that said he was to be avoided. It wasn't personal, not exactly. It was older than him. It's older than his father or his grandfather. Deep in the bones of the village, of the city, was the belief that the one who delivers death. Others leaned into the role, became cruel, embraced the fear, let the mask of the hood become their face. But the best of them, the ones who endured, found a strange kind of peace in the silence. They learned to speak to birds instead of men, to carve wood, to listen for wind, to raise animals, to read. Absorbs some of it, that his soul grows twisted, that his breath carries the chill of the grave, that misfortune follows him like a storm follows the sea. Marriage was rare. Those who accepted the proposal of an executioner often had few other choices. A widow, a woman from another village, someone outcast in her own way, and even then, whispers followed her. If children were born, they bore the burden too. Other parents forbade them from playing together. They were blood kin, it was said. Unholy, prone to madness, prone to violence. That cruelty grew into prophecy. A boy raised with no friends, no welcome, no kindness. What else could he become but the next man with the axe? Some families chose isolation, homes on the outskirts, trades done in secret, quiet lives filled with animals rather than people. But even distance wasn't enough. News traveled. Rumors grew wild. People claimed their cows died when the executioner's cart passed their gate. That wine soured in his presence. His eyes could curse. His breath could wound. His hands, even gloved, left sickness behind. He tried to show kindness. Left apples at the church door. There were places worse than his. And the irony, these same people would cheer at the scaffold, would laugh as a traitor's head dropped, would gather their children to witness the lesson. Loneliness was not an accident. It was part of the job, and it wore down the soul. Some executioners broke, took to drink, fled their posts, died alone. He never stood far from the church, and yet the door was never quite open to him. The bells rang for him as they did for others. The hymns drifted through his window just the same. He would remind the crowd of God's mercy and the wages of sin. There were those who insisted he confess regularly, lest his soul be stained by the accumulation of sanctioned murder. Not in choirs or relics or the golden threads of vestments, but in silence, in justice, in the trembling of a soul just before the end. Some said no, because they were agents of order, tools of divine punishment, like the flaming sword that guarded Eden. Others said yes, because no matter how sanctioned, the act of killing marked the soul. Some said that if he repented for each death, truly repented, he could be saved. Others said that even his repentance was suspect because he would go on killing tomorrow and the day after that. In others, no marker was given. His bones laid in dirt that no one would walk on. And yet a few towns allowed something more. Not because he had to, but because if no one else did, their death would vanish into nothing. And he believed, Evan, if no one else did that, a soul deserved more than silence. A stone, simple carving, no cross, no name, just a symbol. The blade turned downward, as if to say even in death he laid his weapon down. He prayed not aloud, not with folded hands, but with small rituals. He listened to the breath that rattled just before the end. He saw what priests rarely saw: the terror, the peace, the fury, the blank numbness. He saw the ones who mouthed prayers until the rope tightened, the ones who cursed God as the flames rose, the ones who begged for a second chance while the sword was halfway drawn. And still, he did what he was told to do, because someone had to. And because in every death, there was the faintest hope that the soul passed clean, passed whole, passed forgiven. The careful laying of cloth over the condemned's head, the sharpening of the blade without anger. The whisper, he sometimes offered words not written in any holy book, but carried in his bloodline. May this be the last pain you feel. Others gave them alms, but only at a distance. A few, the kind ones, allowed him to kneel at the edge of the garden and pray while the brothers sang inside. And he did. Often he knelt, not to ask for forgiveness, but to remind himself that he still had a soul, that he had not become the mask, that behind the silence, behind the blade, behind the years of death, there still beat a human, heart-flawed, burdened, but still reaching toward the light. It was not absolution, but it was the closest he could come. But what confession could he offer that they did not already know? He did not choose who died. He did not write the laws. He did not sentence or condemn. He only delivered what had already been decided. Still, the weight of the act of countless acts pressed on his chest like a second spine. One made not of bone, but of memory, of screams, of final breaths cut short by his hand. If the townspeople would weep or celebrate, would his sins be counted in blood? Or weighed against the peace he gave those who would have otherwise died in agony? Would God understand, or would he turn away, as so many others had? And yet when the blade fell, when the rope stretched, when the pyre was lit, the executioner, not the priest, became the hand that delivered the final act. In that instant, in that unblinking moment of death, it was not the holy man who stood closest to the soul's departure. It was him, the butcher, the blade bearer, the man with the hood and the quiet eyes. And no matter how many blessings were spoken, no matter how many prayers were chanted, the act itself, killing, remained a paradox too bitter for most to swallow. And still, there was always a space, a breath, a hesitation, an invisible cord that pulled tight whenever he stepped too close to the altar. For in the eyes of the faithful, he carried something not just feared, but spiritually heavy. Because while the executioner's work was sanctioned by law, it walked dangerously close to sin, danced in the thin margin between justice and wrath, and existed in the shadowed space where divine judgment and human punishment blurred into one. When a man was sentenced to die, the church was always present officially, visibly, often loudly. Priests would walk beside the condemned. He would read the rites. Some priests refused to look him in the eye. Others whispered blessings over him without ever laying hands upon his head. He believed in his own quiet way. Theologians argued endlessly over whether executioners were damned. The executioner did not debate theology. He watched the eyes of the dying. He wondered sometimes what his own death would be like, if a priest would come for him. Someone would whisper a prayer into his ear. Some monasteries refused to let executioners enter their gates. In some towns, he was buried outside the cemetery walls. He spoke to the dying when allowed, asked their names, their wishes, sometimes their stories. He bore witness. The priest might offer the last rites, but the executioner offered the last touch. And somewhere between those two lay the line between justice and grace. The crowd always left first. That was the pattern. The sentence would be carried out. The cheers would resoar. The silence would fall, and then, slowly, people would begin to move. Of what it meant to remove a body, or what it required to scrape dried blood from wooden beams, they never asked who unhooked the noose, who washed the block so it would not rot, so it would not draw flies by the hundreds. A body stiffened quickly. He knew the signs, rigor mortis settling in the jaw, the way a hand curled inward once breath was gone. He had seen it in hundreds, maybe thousands, and still it never became routine. Familiar? Yes, but never small. Each corpse had weight. Not just the physical burden, but the symbolic one. This had been a person once, with thoughts, dreams, sins. Now they were silent. Still, and it was up to him to take them from the place of death to the place of burial, in darker times, to the place of display. The smell lingered. It always did. No amount of vinegar or soap could remove it entirely. It lived in the seams of his clothing, in his hair, behind his eyes. He smelled of death not because he wanted to, but because it had nowhere else to go. They never considered that every execution did not truly end when the blade fell or the rope snapped, but because of the silence that came after the screams. The stillness of a square that had roared only hours before. The knowledge that he had touched the boundary between life and death, and had been left behind to clean up what remained. Not because of the gore, but because it meant the story continued. The bodies, the blood, the stains. But when he awoke, the square remained, and the work, as always, waited. More pain. The rope, if soaked in blood, would weaken. It had to be untied, stretched, dried, retied. Even the scaffold itself needed tending. Wood splintered, nails came loose, and he would not allow it to collapse, not with someone on it. Not ever that even in death the condemned were made into tools. Their flesh, a message. Their silence, a scream. Still he did as he was told. Sometimes the family came to claim the remains, did not stop them. He only watched. Sometimes they spat at him, sometimes they cried. A few even thanked him, though he never understood why. Always because he did not write the rules. He only carried them out. It ended here, in the quiet, in the mess, in the ritual of cleaning. Some left laughing, others weeping, a few pale and quiet. Him and the echoes of what had just occurred. The lingering breath of the dying, the sound of a crowd still echoing in his skull. He did not speak while he worked. Words felt wrong in the presence of what remained. Instead, he let the hours pass in silence, let the blood soak his gloves, let the dirt cling to his boots, let the wind dry his clothes as he loaded the final remains. He had all the time in the world to unfasten the straps that held the body still, to pull the cloth back over the face, to lift the limbs into the cart, and if the body had been dismembered, he collected the pieces carefully. Not with horror, not with disgust, but with the precision of a man who knew that no one else would do it properly. He did not speak to the body, but he handled it as gently as one might a sleeping child. The market would resume its rhythm. Bakers would open their ovens. Butchers would sharpen their knives into his gloves, his sleeves, the soles of his boots. It had weight, a thick wetness that clung like guilt, and still he worked through it. He washed what could be washed. He replaced what could not. Buckets of water hauled from the well, rags used until they were no longer useful. Lime spread thick to absorb the smell, to keep the flies away, to prevent disease. He scrubbed because it had to be done. It's not because anyone would thank him, not because anyone would see it, but because death was not clean, and if left untended, it would fester. Children would tug at their mother's sleeves, still whispering about what they had seen. And when all of that returned to normal, when the square emptied of eyes and judgment and spectacle, one man remained behind. One man stayed to finish the work. It's the executioner. For all the talk of law, of punishment, of divine justice, few spoke of the aftermath. He moved slowly, deliberately. There was no rush. No one waited for him. The blood soaked into everything, into the grain of the wood, into the fibers of rope. He learned to move bones, not just with strength, but with understanding. Heads were sometimes spiked atop city gates, arms nailed to crossroads. Warning signs for others. He hated that part. The tools required their own care. The blade must be wiped clean, dried, oiled, wrapped in cloth. If rust took hold, it meant longer deaths. He worked alone, most days. Sometimes a helper, usually a boy from the outskirts, paid in coin and silence. But mostly it was just him. He delivered bodies to graves when ordered. There were times to physicians, if the city wished to study them. At night, he scrubbed his hands until the skin cracked. He slept poorly, not always because of guilt. He dreamed sometimes of rivers, of water deep enough to carry everything away. It ended with the man who stayed behind to carry what no one else would touch. There were places where the blood never dried on the scaffold, because executions were frequent, scheduled, expected. But there were also towns, especially small ones, where death by the blade or rope was a rare event, perhaps once a year, perhaps once in a generation. In those towns, there was no resident executioner, no hooded man polishing tools behind shuttered windows, no local figure who bore the brunt of civic justice. So when the law finally called for a death sentence, they sent word down the road, or across the region, or into the next province. They paid in coin that had been counted twice, sometimes 3 times, as if they feared that too much or too little might curse the transaction. They showed him the scaffold, or the block, or the field where the hanging would take place. He unpacked his own tools, his own noose, knotted carefully over years of practice. Only meals eaten alone in corners, with food that had been set down hastily. Other times, a face he had seen before, thief he'd once spared, now returned for a second judgment. He did not ask questions. He carried out the sentence. One town demanded a public spectacle. Another begged for discretion, arranging the act at dawn, with only a priest and a witness present. Some paid extra for silence, for speed, for mercy. Not murderers, but those who had spoken against kings, priests, nobles. These executions were different. The crowd more divided. Some cheered, some wept, some threw stones not at the condemned, but at him. And still, he did his duty. Because justice, however twisted, still had a price, and someone had to pay it. Because the road gave him something the town could not. Distance. Cover the axe, and left before the next sunrise. The road waited. The horses waited. The silence waited. Dawn. The road, no one knew what he had done. No one whispered his name in dread. He was only another traveler until he arrived. A younger man with nervous eyes, an older one with trembling hands. They did not speak much. They nodded, shared fire, exchanged a few words about tools, about methods, about cities that paid in gold and others that paid in silence. And then they moved on, because even among executioners, there was something solitary in the work. Something that could not be shared even with those who understood. His axe honed so sharp it could cleave candlelight. And when the townsfolk saw these things, some were fascinated. Others sickened. A few turned and left, unwilling to see what they had summoned. And always they asked the same question, whether with words or eyes. Will it be clean? The man of one swing. They trusted him not because they liked him, but because he did not fail. And in matters of death, failure was unacceptable. They hired the executioner. They summoned death. He was a traveler then, a pouch always tied shut, always handed over as if it might burn the skin. Sometimes the amount was generous more than he expected. Sometimes it was barely enough to cover the journey. He accepted it all without complaint, because the coin was not just for the act. It was for the burden. For the silence he carried back onto the road. For the weight of another death added to the tally he never spoke aloud. Man not just of blood, but of roads and wheels and waiting inns. The innkeeper offered a room with eyes lowered, hands trembling as they handed over the key. He was not there to rob or harm or fight, but his presence reminded everyone of something they did not want to face. That justice required a human hand. That laws meant little if someone wasn't willing to swing the blade. He packed his tools into wooden chests, his axe wrapped in cloth, his knives bound in oiled leather, his rope coiled like a serpent beside the sharpening stones. He traveled light, but not quickly. No one hurried toward death. The cart creaked under the weight of silence, pulled by horses who had grown accustomed to the smell, moved quietly through forests, fields, valleys dotted with shepherds who turned their heads as he passed. Villagers who whispered his approach before he'd even arrived. No town was truly unfamiliar, for every town had shadows and he had learned long ago to live among them. When he arrived, there was always a pause, a stillness in the street. The children stopped playing. The doors closed a little faster. The town officials greeted him with equal parts relief and revulsion. They needed him, but they did not want him. He gave no guarantees, gave skill. He inspected the wood, the beams, the rope they had provided usually to course, sometimes already fraying. He had no home when he traveled, only rooms that smelled of straw and damp stone. The executions themselves varied. Sometimes the condemned was a stranger to him. And then there was payment. In some regions, he became known by reputation. The towns rode ahead, questing him by name, by title, by whispered legend. The clean blade, they called him. Occasionally, the road brought him into contact with others like him. There were times he was called to execute not criminals, but rebels. When the work was done, he packed his tools again, wiped them clean, rolled the rope. And somewhere ahead, or behind, another town would whisper his name. In a world where most men inherited land, craft, or debt, there were some born to inherit something far heavier. It's not a trade of cloth or coin, but a duty carved in blood. These were the sons and sometimes daughters of executioners, children born into silence, into isolation, into a life that no one asked for and no one could easily leave. For in many parts of the medieval world, execution was not just a profession, it was a lineage. A role passed down like a torch, like a burden, like a curse. The child of an executioner did not grow up like other children. He did not play in the square or sit near the front of the church or run freely with the village boys. There was always a space around him, caution. A pause in every conversation, a subtle shuffle of feet, a mother's whisper in the ear, that S, the hangman S boy. But in mud, in wind, in the back corner of a field, as his father demonstrated the angle of a swing or the balance of a blade, the lessons were brutal in their honesty. You strike low on the neck, his father might say, too high, and the head won't come clean. Tie the knot under the left ear, another day. That way the neck breaks fast. Not as trophies, not as boasts, but as memory, as accounting, as proof that they had done their work, and that someone else would one day continue it. These records were never shown to outsiders. They were sacred in their own grim way. Some were daughters of executioners themselves, understanding the rules of silence, the weight of ostracism, the sharp edge of reputation. But because of the control, the dignity, the way they stood calm in the face of rage and rot and law, these sons grew into quiet men, serious beyond their years, who understood that their hands held more than tools, they held legacy, and that legacy was not easy to carry. Others married into it through necessity, poverty, or circumstance. And once inside, they rarely left. Their role was essential: preparing garments, scrubbing stains, tending the sick, comforting children who woke from dreams of screaming crowds and blood-soaked wood. And with that, the boundaries were drawn, quiet, invisible, but immovable. And so he aged, and so he passed it on. Their skill, their speed, their precision became legend. When he turned to the boy, now nearly a man, and handed him the rope, or the blade, or simply a nod of permission, "It's yours now," he might say. And with those words, the line continued. City might request them specifically. A nobleman might send for the man whose father served the crown. And so, generation by generation, the line continued, not out of pride, but because it was all they had. Inside the home, life was quiet. The tools were always present, not on display, but never truly hidden. It was a test not of cruelty, but of steadiness. Could the son keep his hand firm? Could he strike clean? Could he carry the burden not just once, but again and again and again? But most stayed, not because they wanted to, but because the world outside did not forget. A man who once bore the name of an executioner found few open doors. The stain was hereditary, clung not to the skin, but to the blood. The block, the rope, the blades, the buckets, the grindstone. A child learned early not to fear them, not to treat them as toys, but to understand their purpose. Fathers rarely explained everything at once. They offered pieces, a lesson in sharpening one day, a warning about the tension in a hanging knot another. A story always grim, always honest told. Not to frighten, but to prepare. Because one day the father would grow old, and the city would still need justice. Someone would have to climb the steps. Some children refused. They fled as far as they could, taking the family name and burying it in distant towns, changing their trade, their accent, their fate. So the apprenticeship began. Not in a guild hall, not with parchment and ink. The child did not ask why. He only listened, because the weight of the role demanded obedience, not curiosity. Some families had record scrolls, or ledgers passed from grandfather to grandson, listing names, dates, places of execution. And in rare cases, families of executioners became known beyond their town. Wives entered these families with eyes wide open. They knew what they were joining. Some children came to admire their father's knot, because of the death they delivered. And then came the day, it always came, when the father's grip faltered, when his sight blurred. The first execution was always watched, by the father, by the town, by the ghosts. If he succeeded, he joined the lineage. If he faltered, the name suffered. So he worked, because in this profession there was no retirement, only a quiet death, in the hope that the next hand would be steady. He lived in a world that was changing faster than anyone could slow it, where the clang of the bell no longer meant a crowd gathering to watch justice unfold in blood and rope, but instead meant a new shipment of goods, a church service beginning, or a train departing from a nearby station. But with neglect, its wood splintering from years of sun and rain and absence. No one had used it in nearly a decade. No one had stood on it in chains. He opened the chest on occasion, not often, and stared at the blade, at the ropes, at the gloves worn smooth by use. The children of those who had once cursed him now studied history books that mentioned executioners only in passing, as if their work had been a curiosity, a side note. Something almost comical in its brutality rather than a role. That had once held the power to shape fear, to define justice, to draw the line between order and chaos. He did not touch them, he did not speak to them, but he could still remember the weight of each one. He was buried on the edge of the cemetery, as had always been done, in a grave that bore no name, only a single carved symbol, the axe turned downward, not to frighten, but to warn. but to rest. Because his job, his name, his silence, all of it had finally come to an end. Not just in his hands, but in his memory, in his bones. In the quiet way the metal had once sung through the air and silenced a crowd in a single breath. No crowd had gathered beneath it to jeer or cry or turn away. It stood like a forgotten monument to a different age. A wooden ghost in the heart of a town that no longer wanted to remember what justice used to look like when it wore a hood and carried a blade. He oiled it still. He climbed the steps each spring and ran his hand across the rail, checking for rot, for weather damage. For the weight of disuse, not because he believed it would be needed again, but because he couldn't bear to let it fall apart completely. Not yet, not while he was still alive, not while it still whispered to him in the quiet hours just before dawn. And the world he had inherited, blocks and beams in careful hands, trained to end life with precision, was slipping away like fog burned off by the morning sun. No visit, no apology. He simply waited and watched the silence grow. The calls stopped coming. The coins stopped arriving. And eventually, even the recognition stopped. New generations walked past him without flinching. Some smiled. Some greeted him kindly. They didn't know. They hadn't been told. The executioner had become irrelevant without context, like a rusty key with no visible door. The townspeople still knew his name, still crossed the street. When they saw him, still whispered behind drawn curtains. When his shadow passed their door, but fewer and fewer of them remembered why he mattered, fewer still could name the last person he had executed. And even he found it difficult sometimes to recall which death had come before which scream had echoed longer, or which prayer had been uttered just before the silence swallowed it. The scaffold, once sturdy and oiled and reassembled with ritual care, had grown brittle with age, its joints creaking not with tension. When new laws were passed, when rulers decreed that the death penalty would be abolished, or at least suspended, or at least hidden behind the locked doors of prisons far from public eyes, he received no letter. He kept the tools anyway, wrapped in cloth, oiled, and stored in a chest beneath the floorboards. People began to forget. The town grew busier. Shops opened. Schools expanded. He did not argue. And when he died, as all men do, there was no scaffold raised for him. No hood. No rope. The town perhaps did not notice. And maybe that was what he wanted most, to be forgotten, so the silence could live on, clean, unburdened, unstained.